The desert air was heavy with heat, and the metallic scent of oil drifted across the hangar floor as Laura Keene moved like a shadow among the giant machines she had come to know better than people, her gloved hands tracing the worn panels of the Apache that rested in front of her like a sleeping beast, her eyes calm but alert to every detail that could mean trouble or survival. She had learned long ago that machines told the truth when people did not. She wiped the glass of the cockpit canopy. With a rag dark with grease and sand, her reflection flickering in the tinted surface, her uniform clung to her skin, and she could feel sweat crawling down her back, but she did not stop. She never stopped because motion kept her mind from drifting. Back to the places she had promised herself to forget. The sound of rotors echoed faintly from another part of the base, and her heart jumped, though she knew it was not this Apache that would take flight today. She crouched near the landing gear, eyes scanning the bolts and hydraulic lines, her breath steady, her movements rehearsed and deliberate. She found a loose strand of wiring tape and frowned. Something about it felt wrong too. New, too deliberate. She reached for it and hesitated, her gut twisting the way it did when she sensed something that should not be there. The hangar lights flickered, and for a second, she thought she saw a shadow move behind the aircraft. But when she turned, nothing was there, only the stillness of metal and sand. Her hand trembled slightly as she brushed dust from a small emblem half buried under layers of paint. It looked like the edge of a patch, torn and faded, but the stitching was fresh. She blinked twice, unsure if her eyes were playing tricks on her, because no patch should have been there. Not on that part of the seat harness, not under maintenance protocol. She leaned closer, her breath ghosting over the fabric as the air around her seemed to thicken with quiet. She could hear her heartbeat, in her ears, loud against the silence that pressed from every direction. A voice echoed from the far end of the hangar, Captain Holt calling her name, casual but firm. She stiffened, straightened her uniform and turned, but he was still several meters away, walking toward her with his helmet under one arm, his expression unreadable. She had always respected him, though she rarely spoke to him except through reports and clipped acknowledgments. He was the kind of man who saw everything without saying much, and she wondered if he could see the unease she was trying to hide. She forced a small nod and said the inspection was nearly done, though. Her throat felt dry like sand. He stepped closer, eyes scanning the aircraft the way a hawk watches the ground. His gaze stopped at the same place where her hand had been a moment before, and she felt a chill crawl up her neck. He tilted his head slightly and asked what that was, in a tone too calm, too quiet. She followed his eyes and saw that the edge of the fabric had curled up, revealing more of the patch beneath a shape like a wing, and a star blackened and half melted by heat. She said it was nothing, maybe leftover material from an old refit, but even as she spoke, she knew he did not believe her because she did not believe herself. He moved closer now, within arm's reach, and his gloved hand brushed the fabric free of dust. His fingers paused on the stitching, and she could see his brow furrow, his jaw tighten in recognition, though he said nothing for a long moment. Only the hum of the overhead lights filled the silence between them. Then he looked at her with eyes that seemed to search through every layer of her until there was nothing left to hide. He asked where she had seen that symbol before, and the question felt like a blade because she had seen it once long ago on a different Apache in a different country, where the air was thick with smoke and the night glowed red. She opened her mouth, but no words came, because how could she explain something that was not supposed to exist anymore? She told herself to stay calm, to breathe, to lie if she had to. But the memory flashed before her eyes, and she saw again the fire, the sound of metal twisting, the screams swallowed. By static, Holt did not push. He just waited like a man who already knew the answer and wanted to hear how she would say it. She turned back to the helicopter and said, "Maybe it was a coincidence. Maybe someone reused material." But her voice trembled and betrayed her. Holt sighed softly, not in relief, but in disappointment, and stepped back. his eyes scanning the ceiling as though expecting someone or something to appear. He said quietly that the patch belonged to a program that never officially existed, that years ago an Apache went down during an unauthorized mission, and that every trace of it had been erased from the records. Laura felt her chest tighten. She remembered the briefing, the one no one was supposed to attend, the faces of men and women who later disappeared from the rosters. She remembered the order to never speak of what happened that night, and the promise she made to herself to forget. But now the evidence was stitched right in front of her, where anyone with the right eyes could see it. She wanted to rip it out, throw it away, bury it, but something deeper whispered that it was there for a reason, and someone had wanted her to find it. Holt stepped closer again, his tone changing softer but sharper. He asked if she had brought this aircraft from her last station. She nodded slowly, unsure what that implied. He said that aircraft had been part of a shipment transferred after the shutdown of an overseas operation, and that it should have been stripped of all insignia before arrival. He asked again if she was certain no one else had touched it. She hesitated and remembered the late night she found one of the hangar doors unlocked when no one should have been inside. She had dismissed it as a mistake. But now the image returned clear and heavy. Her hands began to shake as she knelt again, running her fingers along the stitching. She felt something small beneath the surface, maybe a fold, maybe something hidden. She started to pull at it when Holt grabbed her wrist, not roughly but with urgency. His eyes sharp. He said, "Not here. Not now." She froze, staring at him, trying to read his meaning. His grip loosened, but his gaze did not. He looked toward the hangar entrance, where the shadows seemed thicker than before. Outside, a vehicle engine roared to life, cutting through the heavy air, and both of them turned at the sound. Holt's hand drifted toward the sidearm on his belt, and Laura realized the sound was coming from the maintenance road that led toward the restricted part of the base, the one sealed off since the transfer. She whispered, asking who else was scheduled to be there today, but Holt did not answer. His eyes were locked on the distant movement beyond the glare of the desert sun. The sound grew louder, closer, the echo bouncing off the hangar walls, and Laura felt her pulse quicken, every instinct screaming that whatever was coming was not supposed to be here. Holt stepped forward, slowly scanning the shadows, and she followed, his gaze toward the open hangar doors where heat shimmered in waves over the concrete. But through that blur, she saw something that made her breath stop. A flash of the same black insignia painted faintly on the side of the vehicle as it approached the hangar. Her knees felt weak, her thoughts spinning. She wanted to ask what it meant, who they were, why the mark had returned after so many years. But before she could speak, Holt lifted a hand silently, telling her to stay quiet. His eyes fixed on the approaching vehicle, his jaw tight and unreadable as the sound of the engine filled every corner of the hangar until there was nothing left but the low hum of tension waiting to snap, and then the roar of the approaching engine grew heavier until it drowned out every sound inside the hangar, the rumble vibrating through the metal walls and the concrete beneath their boots. Laura stood frozen beside the Apache, her mind caught between the urge to run and the need to understand. Holt took a single step forward, his silhouette framed against the glare of sunlight flooding through the hangar doors as the vehicle came to a halt, its tires grinding against gravel, sending up a cloud of dust that swirled in the light like smoke. Through the haze, she could just make out the shape of the vehicle, a matte black truck with tinted windows, its surface reflecting nothing. The doors stayed closed for several seconds too long, and the silence pressed harder. Holt kept his hand near his sidearm, but made no move to draw it, his body rigid with control. Laura tried to steady her breathing, but every inhale felt sharp like glass. She thought she saw a movement behind the dark glass, a flicker of a face, but the glare swallowed it before she could be sure. Finally, the driver's door opened, slow, deliberate. A man stepped out tall in desert fatigues with no insignia, no name tag, no rank. His expression unreadable, his eyes hidden behind dark glasses, the kind you wore when you didn't want. To be recognized, he moved with calm precision, like someone who knew he belonged everywhere he went. Holt called out, demanding identification, his voice carrying across the hangar like thunder. But the man did not answer. He only raised one hand slightly, a signal maybe, or a warning. The passenger door opened next, and another figure stepped out. A woman this time shorter, but with the same air of quiet command, her hair pulled tight, her uniform. The same stripped of markings, she carried a small black case in one hand, her gaze drifting toward the Apache and stopping on Laura for just a moment long enough to send a chill through her spine. The woman whispered something to the man beside her, too low for Laura to hear, and then they started walking toward the aircraft, their boots hitting the ground in perfect unison. Laura felt the weight of their approach like gravity. Her instinct told her to back away, but her feet would not move. Holt positioned himself. Slightly in front of her, his voice lower now but steady. He asked again who they were, what their clearance was. The man only replied with a calm, steady tone, saying they were from the Oversight Division here, to review maintenance irregularities. Holt frowned and said there had been no request, no notice. The man smiled slightly and said, "Not all operations require notice." Laura's heart hammered against her ribs, the words Oversight Division echoing in her mind. She had heard that phrase once. In a briefing whispered like a ghost story among maintenance crews, the division that cleaned up after missions, no one talked about erasing what needed to be forgotten. She looked toward the Apache, its dark frame reflecting the two strangers, and for the first time she noticed something she had missed before, a faint scuff mark near the tail rotor, as though a panel had been opened and closed recently. She knew she had not touched that part. The woman placed the black case on a nearby workbench and unlatched it. With soft metallic clicks inside were small tools, scanners, something that looked like a portable data unit. She turned to Laura and asked in a voice so calm it was almost kind whether she had been assigned to this particular helicopter. Since its arrival, Laura hesitated, glanced at Holt, then nodded. The woman smiled faintly, as though she had expected that answer. She said she needed to run a diagnostic and requested Laura's assistance, her tone polite but final, leaving no space. For refusal, Holt started to protest, but the man cut him off with a look sharp enough to end any argument. Holt's jaw tightened, but he stepped back, his hand still resting near his weapon. Laura approached slowly, her gloves trembling. She watched. As the woman ran a small scanner along the seat harness where the patch had been, the screen flashed briefly, then went dark. The woman frowned slightly, as if confirming something she had hoped to find, or maybe hoped not to. She turned to the man and said quietly, "It's here." He nodded once and told her to continue. Laura's pulse quickened. She wanted to ask what they meant. What was here? But before she could speak, the man turned toward Holt and began asking questions about maintenance logs. Transfers, personnel. Holt answered carefully, each word weighed, but Laura could tell he was buying her time. The woman, meanwhile, reached into the patch itself, her gloved fingers prying loose the fabric, where Laura had earlier felt something small. She pulled free a tiny metallic disc, no larger than a coin, its surface engraved with the same faded insignia of the black wing and star. The woman studied it under the light, then held it up between two fingers, her voice low as she said this should have been destroyed. Laura's stomach dropped. She took a step back. Feeling the room tilt, she remembered the night years ago, the fire, the command to erase everything, the warnings about what would happen to anyone who kept evidence. She whispered, asking what it was. The woman looked at her and said, "You already know," then turned toward the man and said, "We need to secure the rest before they arrive, before they arrive." The words struck like a bell. Holt heard it too, his posture stiffening, his eyes narrowing as he asked who was coming. But the man ignored him, pulling a radio from his belt and speaking in a language Laura could not recognize. The static that followed was sharp, cutting through the air. The woman slipped the disc into her. Case snapped it shut and nodded once to him. He moved toward the truck, saying it was time to relocate the material. Holt stepped in front of him, blocking the path, saying the aircraft was under his jurisdiction and would not be moved without command. Authorization. The man's expression did not change. He said authorization had already been granted, then gestured toward the far end of the hangar where two more vehicles were approaching their engines, rumbling like distant thunder. Laura turned and saw the convoy rolling in matte black, identical, unmarked. She felt her knees weaken. This was no inspection. This was something else. Holt drew his weapon finally, his voice ringing out, telling them to stop to identify themselves. But the first man only smiled and raised his hands slightly, saying, "Easy, Captain. We're all on the same side." Laura knew then that he was lying because his eyes betrayed him. They were too calm, too cold, too practiced. She backed away inch by inch until her shoulder brushed against the Apache's cold metal. The woman noticed and her gaze sharpened. She said, "Don't move, not another step," but Laura couldn't stop. She reached for the cockpit ladder, her mind screaming at her to run, to hide, to protect whatever secret was still buried inside that machine. Holt glanced at her just once, a silent signal she couldn't quite understand, and then chaos exploded. The sharp crack of a weapon firing tore through the air, echoing against the hangar walls. The sound, so sudden, it left her ears ringing. Laura dropped to the floor, her hands over her head. Smoke drifted from the far end of the room. One of the black vehicles had skidded to a halt, doors flying open, armed figures spilling out. Holt shouted something, but she couldn't hear over the noise. The woman from the oversight team was gone, vanished into the smoke. The man by the truck shouted an order, and the armed figures advanced, weapons raised. Laura crawled toward the shadow of the Apache, her hands slick with sweat and dust. Her mind racing, she needed to reach the cockpit. She didn't know why, but something told her that whatever the patch had hidden was only part of the truth. Maybe there was more, something deeper, something left behind for someone like her to find. She climbed the ladder, breath ragged as the gunfire echoed behind her. She reached the seat, pulled herself inside and felt under the console, her fingers brushing against another edge of fabric, tucked tight into the seam. Voices shouted her name below one of them, Holt. Another unfamiliar closer. She hesitated, her heart pounding so loud it drowned the rest of the world. She pulled the fabric free, a second patch identical to the first, but this one heavier, and when she turned it over, she saw faint etchings burned into the back lines that looked like coordinates, and a single word carved so shallow she almost missed it. And as she read it, the hangar lights above her flickered once, twice, and then the lights dimmed and the hangar was swallowed by shadow. The low hum of the generators faltering as if the entire base held its breath. Laura clutched the second patch in her shaking hands, the coordinates carved into its back glowing faintly under the emergency light that flickered above her. She whispered the numbers to herself, though she did not know why they felt important, like a memory she could almost touch but could not place. Holt's voice echoed below, shouting orders, his tone sharp and desperate. The clash of boots and metal filled the air as the armed men advanced through the smoke. Laura slid from the cockpit and dropped to the ground, landing hard, pain shooting through her knees, but she forced herself up. She had to reach. Holt had to show him what she found. She moved through the haze, her hands trembling, her lungs burning, every breath heavy with dust. She could see him now, crouched behind a tool crate, exchanging fire with the intruders, his face streaked with sweat and determination. She shouted his name, but her voice was lost in the roar of chaos. She tried again, louder, and this time his head snapped toward her, his eyes widening when he saw what she held. He motioned for her to get down, but it was too late. One of the armed men had spotted her and raised his weapon. Holt fired first. The man dropped, and silence followed for one brief, impossible heartbeat. Laura stumbled toward Holt, clutching the patch to her chest. He asked what it was. She told him there were coordinates etched into it. Holt took it from her, studying the markings under the weak light, his expression changing from confusion to something closer to fear. He said these coordinates pointed to a location deep in the restricted desert zone, a place erased from every map years ago. The sound of rotors began to grow in the distance, heavy, low, and unmistakable. A helicopter approaching fast. Laura looked toward the open hangar doors, the sand outside swirling under the downdraft. Holt cursed under his breath and said they were coming to retrieve whatever was inside the Apache. He turned to Laura and told her to run to the back exit to get the coordinates to the base command before they were intercepted. She shook her head, refusing. She said if this was what they had been hiding all along, she needed to see it through with him. Holt started to protest, but the ground trembled under the force of the helicopter landing outside the hangar, its floodlights blinding white pouring through the open doors. The armed men began to retreat, moving toward the light as if following an order from someone unseen. Laura reached for Holt's arm, but he pushed her toward the shadows, saying, "Go before they see you." She wanted to argue, but his tone left no room. She turned and ran, her boots striking the floor in rapid echoing beats, each one louder than the last, as the light behind her grew brighter and the roar of the rotors filled the air. She reached the service corridor just as the first explosion tore through the hangar, the shock wave knocking her to the ground, the world tilting as heat and dust enveloped her. She struggled to her knees, coughing, the patch still clutched in her fist. She looked back through the smoke, trying to see Holt, the Apache, the men, but all she saw was fire reflecting off twisted metal, and the shadow of the helicopter lifting slowly into the air, carrying something large and dark beneath it as it vanished into the storm of sand. Laura rose to her feet, unsteady, eyes burning with determination, and whispered the coordinates one last time before disappearing into the desert night. As behind her, in the distance, the sound of another engine began to rise from the darkness, and then